Yes, welcome to the first Asia Pacific Conference of 2021, put on by the Minnesota China Business Council. I'm Larry Mahoney, founder of Asia Direct Resource, an Asia-based product sourcing and supply chain management company, and I'll be your MC today. Our program today will have three speakers: Tom Hanson, Bob Oberlies, and Ben Baker. Tom Hanson is co-chair of MCBC and is a former diplomat with the U.S. Foreign Service Office and is currently diplomat in residence at the University of Minnesota. Tom will address geopolitical aspects of the Biden administration policy as we re-engage with the single most significant and important political force, China. Bob Oberlies is MCBC's other co-chair, and Bob heads the Asia Pacific practice at Fredrikson and Byron. And he has been advising leading multinationals in cross-border transactions and investments in the Asia for more than 20 years. Bob will speak to the complex transition to this re-engagement in China and increasingly conflicting standards on technology and data governance. Ben Baker leads sourcing and supply chain management at Blue Dot, a multinational supplier of modern and contemporary furniture. Ben will get down and dirty, moving from the strategic view to the tactical realities of a crazy, disrupted supply chain. As Beth Allison has said, after each speaker, we'll have a brief Q&A, and at the end of the program, we'll open for general Q&A. Submit your questions to the Zoom chat function. Now, our first speaker, please, Mr. Tom Hanson.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks very much. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. In my remarks, I'll be talking about the very contradictory situation that's evolving right now in U.S.-China relations, where we see a lot of tension, in some ways growing tensions, but also a lot of opportunity. And I'm going to try to walk us through that. I'll be showing some images along the way here. So obviously, one of the biggest transitions is the new life we all have with COVID, and it's had a lot of big impacts. And the political transition going on right now in the United States from the Trump administration to Joe Biden, who right from the get-go, from his inaugural address and the many, many executive orders he's issued since assuming office, has made clear in his words, America is back. We are going to emphasize relations with our allies. We're going to try to be the indispensable nation again and try to galvanize our allies, in part to stand up to China. This is something that the Trump administration was already undertaking in a very sharp and confrontational way. Secretary of State Pompeo had explained our policy in terms of a confrontation with China of two systems, democracy and autocracy, and with a specific focus on the Communist Party of China. Once again, a very aggressive policy. I think the Biden team will be milder on the rhetoric, but some of the same policies I think are going to continue, as I will explain. Now, the United States credibility in pursuing policy right now was severely damaged, in my view, by what happened on January 6th. As you can see here, as far as the eye can see, the protesters, 74 million voters, voted for something other than Joe Biden. We'll see, to what degree the United States can retain leverage soft power in spite of what's happening here at home with our tremendous polarization and the fact that the way our administrations change every 4 years and undo the policies of the previous administration, many countries, including our own allies, are beginning to wonder just how predictable we are going forward. And this has a big impact on our ability to pursue some of these policies. Now, COVID obviously has been a huge game changer in all of this. It's had social effects. It has led, unfortunately, to a deepening of sort of U.S. mistrust of China. The latest polling from Pew shows that only 20% of Americans right now have a positive view on China, of China. In contrast, it's a little higher for Russia, 22%. It's not as bad as North Korea, which is at 11%, but still, this is a huge decline in U.S. public opinion on China, which is a big factor. COVID has also had a big impact economically. We can see the striking change in FDI flows that went on during 2020, where more is flowing in now to China than into the US. So whether this will continue, the $1.9 trillion stimulus package is going to have obviously a big effect. But it's pretty clear that as China recovers faster than the rest of the world, it's getting back to full operation. A lot of Western capital and US capital is gravitating to China regardless of the political policies at present. In 2020, the Chinese GDP grew by 3%, amazingly, in spite of all the upheaval. The US GDP shrank by 2.3%. Chinese nominal GDP has now risen to over 70% that of the US. It now represents 17% of global GDP. As recently as 2010, it represented only 10% of global GDP. So there is a continued rise. The Japanese Center for Economic Research has estimated that now China will surpass the US in nominal GDP by 2028. It has long since passed us in terms of purchasing power parity. So this is part of the change in the world and part of the challenge going forward. Now, I'm going to try to describe US foreign policy in terms of the various personalities involved, because I think you can see the emphasis that each one has says something about our policy. There's Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, is in the back, second from the right. Now, Jake, who is from Minneapolis, he went to Southwest High School, is, I would say, the forward-looking of the two between Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken. He is focused on basically restoring a U.S. national industrial policy as part of a competition with China. Now, no one dares to use the phrase national industrial policy because it implies too much of a government role. It's in most countries that would be a natural thing to talk about, not here. So we talk rather about an intersection of economic and national security. The idea that our national security is being affected now by supply chains that are way out of our control. We are going to repatriate a lot of supply chains, massive investment in research and development, trying to get the U.S. industrial base back in operation. The priority is seen in the deputy that Jake Sullivan, Dalip Singh, formerly Treasury Department, Federal Reserve Bank. And one of the key aspects of this will be trying to get back into the game on AI, quantum, all these areas of advanced tech where China, quite frankly, is moving ahead of us. A major study was released of Eric Schmidt of Google, who was chairing it up, warning that we're already falling behind in a lot of these key technologies, especially quantum. Jian Wei Pan is arguably the greatest mind on quantum in the world. China, late last year, did something astonishing. It pulled off quantum computing using particles of light, photons. We have not done this yet. Their new computer is estimated to be about 100 trillion times faster than existing regular computers and 10 billion times faster than the Google Sycamore machine, which was unveiled earlier this year. The challenge is real. And I might note that China is also looking at this now. They just completed their National Party Congress. They announced their new 5-year plan. And it's all about technology and national security, just the way Jake Sullivan is talking, except from their point of view. Whether it's microchips, semiconductors, quantum AI, China wants to increase investment and bring more and more production home. This is a decoupling that's underway in high tech. There's no question about it. The question is how far it will go.
Tom,
Yes.
your microphone is slightly muted. Can you either move it closer?
Hopefully I'll get a little closer to it here. Sorry about that.
That's much better. Thank you.
Is that better? Great. Yes, it's a matter of distance. So anyway, as I say, the Chinese Communist Party is just
I'm sorry, Tom. Now it's worse.
Okay, I don't know what's going on here. I'll try again here. Is that better? Just a second here. Okay, I'll try to speak loudly and directly into it here. So if Jake Sullivan is the more sort of forward-looking advisor, I'd say that Tony Blinken is the more backward-looking. As Secretary of State, I don't mean this in a necessarily negative way, but he looks back to the 1930s. He's a very close friend of Robert Kagan, who was a prominent neoconservative intellectual. And in joint articles, they talk about how we are living in a time like the 1930s, with autocracy on the rise, democracy declining around the world, and it's up to the U.S. to convene a League of Democracies. A summit of democracies is something that's coming up very soon in order to offset these trends. And so, and also Blinken is looking very much at the Indo-Pacific. I'll be talking about that later as part of responding now to the China challenge. He's also emphasizing human rights, and especially on Xinjiang, where he said that what's happening there isn't a genocide. He used the same words that Pompeo used. Xinjiang is very important for China, as we all know. It's in the middle of all of its large plans for the Belt and Road and other initiatives. So the idea is we're going to try to galvanize our allies in this strategy now, looking toward China. And here's where things become interesting. There are a lot of contradictory signals. Joseph Borrell, the chief foreign affairs, the foreign minister of the EU, has said recently that the United States is no longer really dependable, and he predicts divisions between the U.S. and Europe will develop over Iran and over China. In other words, that Europe is not necessarily on the same wavelength. That if you look at polling in Europe, the European Council on Foreign Relations did a major poll announced in January. If you look at the results here, can you rely on the U.S. in green there? Europe cannot always rely on the U.S. We need to look after our own defense. Look how much of a majority that point of view is. Only 10% say the U.S. will always protect Europe. This was after Biden's election and before January 6th. And on the very interesting question, if there's a disagreement between the U.S. and China, what would you like your country to do? In green, I would like my country to remain neutral.
Tom, it's still quite choppy. I don't know if there's something else that we can do or go.
I have no idea why this is happening.
It was fine earlier.
I don't know why. Is it coming through at all?
Not really.
No.
Does that help any better?
You just use the computer mic?
I suppose I could do that. See what happens. How's that now? Is that any better?
Yeah, Tom, we can't hear you at all anymore.
That's better. It's just very light. If you can increase the volume of your mic.
Yeah, let's see what I can do. I'll just increase my. Is it better than the other one?
It's not as choppy, but it's just very faint.
Okay. Well, let's see here. Okay, how is this now? Is this any better?
Still quite faint.
Okay. No idea why this is happening. Okay. I just speak loudly and carry on?
I think so.
All righty. We'll hope that this works. I'll try to articulate. Anyway, as you can see, the vast majority in Europe say that Europe should not take sides in the case of a disagreement between the U.S. and China. So President Biden has a long history of contact with Xi Jinping. Over the years, they've had many meetings. And the big issue between the U.S. and China now as they settle in is what's happening out in Asia and within the first island chain, especially. You can see there the first series of dots, where of course Hong Kong and Taiwan are. Now Taiwan is emerging as a major flashpoint. Tensions are increasing over Taiwan. I would note in the lower left, the Pratas Island, which is Dongsha in China, that may become important. The Trump administration already had much more contact with Taiwan, with Tsai Ing-wen and her representatives, more high-level meetings, more military aid, and which China, of course, protests against. And the Biden administration took a similar step by inviting the Taiwan rep in Washington, D.C. to attend the inauguration. First time that's ever happened. So China sees a lot of continuity here in what the U.S. is doing. Now, China has been increasing its military activity in the South China Sea, the first island chain, and a lot of exercises around the Pratas Islands, there where the yellow arrow ends up. If things get much worse, you could imagine possibly a Chinese threat to the Pratas Islands. It wouldn't be a threat to Taiwan, but it would be symbolic of how serious the issue would become. We'll have to hope that it does not escalate to that point. That the U.S. is sending in more frequent aircraft carrier groups into the South China Sea, and China has begun some very aggressive exercises. A month or so ago, they flew over one of our groups with their equivalent of a B-52 bomber and fighter jets, and locked on with radar and simulated a saturation attack on our fleet. Now, we have no defense right now against Chinese missiles in the area. Our aircraft carrier groups are exposed. So this is part of the tension that is evolving, and that may lead the U.S. to position medium-range missiles in Asia. That's one thing that's on the agenda, INF. Kurt Campbell is the guy heading up the Indo-Pacific strategy. He's a carryover from Biden, from Obama rather, and so a lot of continuity, a lot more coordination on the U.S. side. And one of the key elements of this is what's called the Quad, and that's the U.S., Australia, India, and Japan. Once again, trying to galvanize our allies in the security dialogue and perhaps more coordination. Now, I said there's a lot of contradictory developments right now. In spite of what the Biden administration is trying to do now, there have been two major trade agreements signed just in recent months, which are at variance with our desire to galvanize our allies. Late last year, the nations of Asia came together with China to sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. All these countries are involved except for India, which is still trying to protect its economy. This will deepen supply chains in Asia. This is our allies doubling down on trade with China. And the same thing is happening with Europe. In January, the EU and China concluded a major investment deal. We tried to persuade the Europeans not to go through with this, but they did. And so we find a situation where our allies in Asia and in Europe are still drawn to China. And I think the basic issue is this: while we are pursuing a containment strategy toward China, The Chinese are engaged in what I would call an economic mobilization strategy. It's like we're playing two different games on two different boards. And our allies are still responding to the draw of the Chinese economy. And as the world is breaking down into regions with decoupling, there are some limits on how far we can go on China. For example, we do not want to push these three countries together. China and Russia are growing closer. Russia has indicated that if the tensions increase, they will grow even closer to China. And this kind of an arrangement in Eurasia of Russia, China, and Iran growing closer would be a very negative development from the US point of view, and I think sets a limit to what we are likely to do. And the other is that we need to cooperate with China in many areas, not least of which climate change. And John Kerry will probably be an advocate, since he's doing climate, for keeping things on an even keel with China to allow cooperation on pandemics, on economics. China is the world's leader in key technologies, solar panels and other things. So I'll conclude here. A lot of contradictory signals. It's, I think, a good sign, the final point, that it's just been announced that on March 18th, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan will meet with the top two Chinese foreign affairs figures, Wang Yi, foreign minister on the left, and Yang Jiechi, the top foreign policy official, on March 18th. We'll have to hope that the beginnings of a dialogue take place that can get the relationship somewhat back on track, especially economically. So I'll stop there. Sorry about the audio, and look forward to questions later.
Any questions at this time?
Okay.
Nope, why don't you go ahead and introduce our next speaker?
We will now move on to Mr. Bob Oberlies.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Sounds good.
Great. All right. Thank you, Tom, for those remarks. I'm going to talk about some of the similar issues, but more from a kind of my practice experience as a lawyer for the last 20 years, living in China, living in the US. I first started working in China in 1996. And so I've been following US-China relations quite closely for the last couple decades or so. And I think, one constant, it seems to me, is that we're always facing kind of a new crisis that threatens to derail the relationship and decouple the two countries. And I think over the years I've come to approach this instability with kind of a sense that this too will pass, and put my faith in the great stabilizer being the simple fact that we're both vitally important to each other. But each new crisis brings a question of whether is this time different? Has the intensity escalated to the point that we're in a more serious position, and has something fundamentally changed? Are both, I think in terms of decoupling, it's what a lot of people are talking about, and the balkanization of supply chains and the decoupling of the countries. And I think that, are both sides looking for more self-reliance and self-sufficiency? Are we starting to decouple? Are we going to gradually become less vital to each other? And will this lead to further instability? And what will that do to global supply chains? And how will the U.S. administration navigate these, quite perilous waters? So these are kind of questions that I'll touch on a little bit in my remarks. Back in the 90s, I worked in Beijing at the American Chamber of Commerce, and one of our key priorities was working on behalf of U.S. business to get China into the World Trade Organization. And back then, there was a very broad cross-section of U.S. business leaders that they believed it was going to be good for their businesses to get China into the WTO. And in the end, in late 2001, nearly 20 years ago, China did accede to the WTO. And the idea was that with WTO accession, this would pave the way for China's integration into the world economic system. They'd play by a rules-based multilateral system, and we'd all live happily ever after. But I think even back then, some China observers, kind of, including myself, thought that or expected that China would ultimately follow its own path, and I think that's largely what we've seen. I participated, helped write and published this. It was AmCham's first white paper on American business, doing business in China in 1998, and in that we identified what we thought were the most pressing business issues of the day. And looking through the white paper today, I still have a copy in my office. It's kind of remarkable how the same issues persist, and concern over IP theft and forced tech transfer and lack of market access, and the diverging industry standards, and the sort of the tight control that state-owned enterprises had on the economy. Those are the kind of key issues that the business community deals with today. The big difference is that the Chinese market has just gotten so much bigger. But those are still just as challenging. China's grievances with the U.S. haven't really changed that much either. There's concern about kind of the U.S. sort of a lack of respect for the China system, and we're not giving due credit for all that the party has accomplished in pulling hundreds of millions out of poverty so quickly, and then of course this fear that the West is trying to contain China and limit China's legitimate and peaceful rise. So it kind of always seemed that it's hard to find that magic formula for sort of a real win-win between the two economies. And I think, when we look back at the 8 years that Xi Jinping has been in power, he became president in 2013. And, it doesn't look like, in my recollection, there's been many particularly warm points in the U.S.-China relationship during that period. And, I think a big shift in terms of the U.S. business community heading into the pandemic, I think that pro-China wing that pushed so hard to get China into the WTO 20 years ago, that wing has definitely shrunk. And this means that, there's fewer China champions in DC, and with fewer champions in the U.S. business community, I think it's opened the door for hawks in DC, more space to ring alarm bells. And we saw this in the case of One Belt One Road, and even more so in the Made in China 2025 policy. And I think Made in China 2025 really put Washington on edge. And this was, I think, most folks on the call are probably familiar with that, but that's an industrial policy that seeks to make China dominant, and those were the words that were used in the policy that so alarmed so many people. But they're dominant in all kinds of global high-tech manufacturing and a lot of the items that Tom mentioned. And this would be, the goal is that they're going to pursue IP to catch up with and then surpass Western technological prowess in these. And it's 5G, it's advanced robotics, it's AI. And I think, frankly, such an industrial policy, it sounds completely reasonable to me. I think most leading industrial nations would be working very hard on these. And I wish, we in the U.S. had a more coherent national economic strategy. I don't really know what it's, I don't think we've had one, and hopefully Biden will develop one. I don't think we had one in the prior administration. So, But regardless, the 2025 policy for China, it did seem to fuel a lot of the hawkishness that we saw in the years, following with the tariffs and the escalating trade war. And, the trade war, when that came, many U.S. companies were caught in the crosshairs, and it proved to be a massive shock. And, if you were a U.S. company and you were importing goods, and you were hit by tariffs, and initially it was 10%, and then it was 25% or more, you weren't able to endure that for very long. And I think, many boardrooms, when they hit that shock, they were surprised. They knew that China was key to their supply chain, but they perhaps were surprised at just how reliant they were, and kind of the order was to, make sure this doesn't happen again. And part of that meant to try to diversify a bit. And that, I spent much of the past 3 years helping companies, find workarounds and backup plans. And I think that most companies with a lot of effort came out stronger than before in terms of their supply chains, much more resilient, much more diversified. But I think we also saw other protectionist policies. We've seen the U.S. national security review process for foreign acquisitions in the U.S. become stricter. I've been doing cross-border transactions for the past 2 decades, and there was a period where there was a huge amount of FDI and inbound investment into the U.S. by mostly state-owned enterprises, Chinese state-owned enterprises. But over the last maybe 5 years or so, it's fallen off significantly. And CFIUS is the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., and that's our National Security Review Committee. And it used to focus primarily on foreign acquisitions of controlling stakes in U.S. companies. So if you bought the whole company or you had a controlling stake, that would be something that would potentially trigger a filing and review. And in August of 2018, this was expanded to cover even non-controlling investments in critical technologies. And so it was a trend, but certainly over recent years, there's been a huge fall off in Chinese FDI into the U.S. And thinking back to 2013, when Smithfield was purchased by Shanghai, that was a $7 billion acquisition of a U.S. pork processor, and it remains the largest ever Chinese acquisition of an American company. And there's no way, in my view, that would have been approved in more recent years. And that deal gave the company ownership over 1 in 4 pigs raised in the U.S. So it just shows you how far things have shifted a bit. And I think in the battle over 5G, we saw our government prohibit U.S. telecom companies from purchasing Huawei equipment, and we've put controls on purchasing power system equipment from China. We've expanded our do not export list to a lot of Chinese companies. One of the big ones that maybe we're seeing some repercussions from now is the U.S. blacklist of a major Chinese tech company, SMIC, that's the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. And that's China's most advanced semiconductor firm. And the blacklist effectively made SMIC radioactive for U.S. investors and many global investors. And now we're seeing a global shortage of semiconductor chips. And I think, based on what I've seen and read, it's partly because of supply chain issues with COVID, and but it's also being attributed to kind of unintended blowback or consequences of our export controls, and this kind of growing tech battle between the U.S. and China. And it does look like we now, between oil and semiconductor chips, it's like this is the key battleground, and we have a bit of a chip war going on. And I think this is this has led chip manufacturers and those that require chips to start stockpiling them. And the automotive sector has been particularly hard hit. And there's just a massive shortage of certain semiconductors that are kind of the computer of the vehicle. And, it's caused certain manufacturers to shut down much of their production, both in China and in the US. I read the other day that there's a GM plant in Kansas City that had to shut down, and it's expected that it's going to take several months to resolve. So these are just a few examples of kind of how complex the supply chain has become, and it makes policy making really challenging because we're so interconnected, and often the policies have many unintended consequences. And I think that what we're seeing from China right now in the rhetoric is much more heated. And some would say, well, this is because of the trade protectionist and the national security policies that we've been doing over the last few years, and they were very blunt instruments. And but I think ultimately these are somewhat longer term trends, and they're sort of playing out now, but they stretch back to kind of early days of China's economic reforms. And China's always been really good about strategic thinking and looking at the long term, and coupling where it needed foreign technology. And most recently you have Tesla and the EVs, but in years past it was Siemens and for high-speed rail. And then they would be uncoupled though in sectors that they didn't think they needed foreign assistance, and it's often kind of the state-owned champion. So I think like the Made in China 2025 was just the latest iteration of this highly strategic system that they have. And there's a reason why Google and Amazon and Twitter and Uber and none of them were allowed to take hold in China, and that paved the way for Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent and Huawei. So part of it is we've seen this. We've seen this. So a lot of this is not that new, but it does seem like everything is growing in intensity. So we now have a new administration, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this will play out. And I think it's looking like the phase 1 trade agreement and the penalty tariffs will likely remain in place. And a lot of the actions over Chinese firms, the delisting of some of the Chinese firms and those linked to Xinjiang, I think those are likely to stay in place. And all the concerns that U.S. companies have had over the IP and the tech transfer, and then some of the more kind of global strategic concerns that Tom talked about, and Taiwan and in the South China Sea, those are probably only going to intensify. I think the Biden administration is, we'd hope that it will cause fewer disruptions and kind of work better with the sort of global economic order. But I think there's limits to what they can do, and I don't think we're going to go back to the TPP anytime soon. I think it's still deeply unpopular with a lot of American voters that Biden needs to attract. And I think Tom talked about this a little bit as well. One thing that has seemed to be kind of coalesced in Washington, that in a lot of Biden's picks so far that will be instrumental in strategy, seem to have adopted this view, is that China is a chief competitor, and that's going to be their focus, and that partly the sort of the policies over the last 20 years were somewhat of a failure for the U.S. and has been in a long-term competition, and somehow either we didn't know it or we didn't pay attention to it, but now everyone is focused on it, and that's going to be kind of a top priority. And China recognizes this, and it does appear that there's a lot more focus in terms of their rhetoric that they're accelerating efforts to build self-reliance. And maybe just to talk a little bit about what we can look forward to in on the sort of the trade and supply front for 2021. I think ultimately supply chains were already changing massively in China before the pandemic and before the trade war. We were seeing low cost production moving elsewhere anyways, and that was partly driven by China. China didn't want to be the dirty manufacturer of the world anymore, and they wanted to move up the supply chain to very high value, high tech technology. And so U.S. companies were already planning for that. They were moving to second tier or third tier cities in China. They were moving to Vietnam and other countries. And then the trade war accelerated that. The pandemic accelerated that. But all of that said, if you read AmCham's latest member survey, or if the U.S. China Business Council, you'll find that consistently very high percentage of member companies that report a desire to further invest in China, and but it's more a matter of kind of in China for China, or in China for selling in the Asia market. I think ultimately the kind of these restrictions on the sale and export of certain critical goods like the semiconductors I mentioned, this is probably going to become a kind of a chronic problem, or it's going to stick around for a while. I think at least a lot of my clients, it seems like we felt fairly limited effect on some of the U.S. export controls, but I think it's early days on that. So I think we could start to see a lot more from the administration on that. I think that there's this global container shortage, and I think Ben will talk a little bit about this. But these are I think I don't know. Some of the folks on the call their companies might be dealing with this, but it's sort of a massive problem that just kind of doesn't seem like there's any really good short-term solution for. And it just partly came out of the sort of this huge demand for products from China, particularly from in the healthcare space, and all this work from home technology. And then there's a lot of factors for it, but it's causing massive problems. And I think by one estimate I had read, they were saying that we'd need 500,000 more 20-foot containers to meet current demand. I think that one of the other challenges that we're starting to see is that China is being more assertive in terms of trying to set their own standards, and particularly for some of these emerging technologies. And rather than having a global standard or following kind of the current standards, coming up with the China standard. And this is going to, the concern is that it's going to lead to more fragmentation and balkanization, and companies are going to increasingly need to manufacture sort of one product for China and one for North America and one for Europe, and that's going to drive up costs significantly. There's also concern about the emergence of kind of different data governance regimes in China and the US and the EU. I think that this has been going on for the last few years now. I think China generally has a policy that is very much focused on kind of protecting the parties' interests in data management and ownership and protection. The U.S. is more corporate driven, sort of what do companies need in terms of processing big data, and I think the EU's regime is much more kind of focused on citizen privacy rights. This is regardless creating a lot of challenges for U.S. companies who are operating in China, and you have a huge amount of data. If you're like a Medtronic or there's just so much of your data that you can't export and bring back to the U.S. And so it really limits sort of the potential for utilizing big data across sort of boundaries. And I think the telecom issue is one that is continuing to cause a lot of challenges. And this kind of goes back to the Snowden revelations that I think once those came out, there was a lot of Cisco and other big companies, their sort of China business model blew up overnight. And China started to say that you can't use U.S. Routers and all this other technology because it's being used to spy, and there's been sort of this tit for tat back and forth on that ever since, and it's creating massive hassles. And I think on the U.S. side, there's a lot of U.S. players that were in China in a big way, and they had very significant market positions, and they're now kind of being pushed out into much smaller roles or niche roles. Well, these are just a few examples. I don't want to take too much more time, but maybe just to wrap up, I'll return to some of my original questions when I started. To the question of are both sides looking for more self-reliance, and are they looking to have a more self-sufficient supply chain and industrial base? I think the answer, of course, is yes. Are we starting to decouple? I'd argue we've always been selectively coupled, and we're now just entering a new stage where we'll couple in new ways and less so in others, but continue to be vitally important to each other. The question of will we gradually become less vital and will that lead to further instability? It does appear like that is the where we're heading. And then what does that mean for global supply chains? I think it's more of what we've seen, more localization, more manufacturing in China for serving the China market rather than export to the U.S. More shifting of production to other countries that can make the supply chain more resilient, and a continued divergence between the economies on trade and defense and technology policies. In summary, I think 2021 is going to be a wonderful year. I think that's my message, ultimately. But I'll end there, and then I'll turn it back to you, Larry or Ben.
Good. Yes. Actually, we have two questions that we're going to take right now. And again, I'll remind the listeners that we have a Q&A at the end of the program. But these are little extensive questions, so you might want to take notes. First question for either Tom or Bob. What do you see happening to the four pillars of balanced trade? Trade, tariffs, currency, control, IP protection, state subsidies with the Biden administration. Will we return to pushing only one or two of the four and therefore still remain in an unfair situation? Or will we tackle the four and simultaneously, as started with Trump? Who wants to try that one?
Tom, do you want to take that first?
You want to try? Yeah. Shall I take that, Bob, or do you want to take it?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think the Biden team will probably try to ease the tariffs a bit, and certainly make things more predictable. I think one of the issues, by the way, am I coming through okay?
Yes, very
Good.
well.
Finally. So one of the issues with the Trump approach, although some steps were, are being followed up by Biden, it was a bit unpredictable and a little bit volatile at times. I think that the Biden team will try to be more in dialogue with the Chinese, give them more of a heads up what's coming. That probably will start now in Alaska on March 18th. I agree with Bob, they will keep some of the tariffs, but I could see them gradually easing some of those. Quite frankly, in spite of pressure from within the Democratic Party, for example, not to go back into the TPP, I think Bob is right on that too. I think for the Biden team, this is all about geopolitics, and that it's all about engaging our allies. And so to the extent that our allies want to trade with China, I don't think we're going to push them to the wall on that. I think we're going to, try to keep trade going. But I could see more punitive sanctions coming along, more steps against the Chinese tech sector. For example, all these quantum semiconductor chips, that sort of thing. Whereas I think on agriculture, trade, other aspects of trade will probably ease up a bit. So I think they'll be just as strong on IP. Currency is going to be very interesting because China is probably in the first stages of heading toward a national digital currency. I think that is happening. And the Chinese and the Russians are doing almost everything without the dollar now. I think that there's a gradual step-by-step move away from the dollar that's going on in the global economy. How fast this will go is hard to say, but I would watch on the currency front what China's doing, moving toward a digital currency. It's a win-win for them. It allows them greater control of their economy and of their citizenry, and it gets them out from underneath the dollar. A lot of countries would like to get away from the dollar just because of the way we've been using sanctions. And even our European allies have talked about this, trying to find ways to lessen their reliance. So, Bob, I'll turn the other ones over to you in terms of the main legs.
The next question, Bob, maybe you want to tackle this one. Will we continue the double standard on publicly listed companies on Wall Street, which has allowed the Chinese listed companies to not provide transparency? Or will we continue the delisting movement started in 2020?
I don't see any significant move to maybe double down on the delisting. I think that there were some efforts to do that. There's a tremendous interest in these SPACs, and there's a tremendous interest by Chinese companies to participate in the U.S. Capital markets through these SPACs, and I think that there so far I haven't seen a lot of limitations on that. It hasn't been as active as you might think, given the demand. But I think that I don't expect anything very draconian on kind of cracking down on that particular issue. It's on the radar, but I'm not anticipating that to be a top priority. And just going back to I think on the trade, some of the trade issues and the currency, the China's reliance on the U.S. dollar is kind of seen as its Achilles heel. It's so dependent, and they've been trying desperately to find ways to become less dependent, and so I think they'll be working very hard on other ways to internationalize the renminbi, but it's a difficult one because they don't want capital to flow out of China, and it's been a real challenge, but it's a top priority for them. And I think the phase one trade agreement and the penalty tariffs, I do think they're going to remain in place, but as Tom says, maybe they'll be rolled back a little bit as a concession. We'll see what comes out of these meetings next week or on the 18th in Alaska. I think IP protection is always one that, as I said, back in the 90s, it was always a big issue. It's always the top issue and nothing ever happens. It depends on enforcement by China. The laws are on the books. The law, they don't need any new laws. It's just about meaningful enforcement, and I don't anticipate there's going to be anything there. Similarly, on the kind of the tech transfer that a lot of the big companies, Boeing and Honeywell and other companies, have complained about when China was trying to create their passenger jet, and other, I think that's just going to continue. There's not going to be any significant relief on that front. It's just the cost of doing business. I'm quite interested to watch Tesla. Tesla is getting about 20% of their revenue in China. They are still the number one EV vehicle, despite having hundreds of EV companies, but they're still the market leader by a long shot. And this is a premium automobile, and they're the only foreign automotive manufacturer that has a 100%. It's 100% foreign owned, that they didn't have to JV. So that'll be very interesting. How many years will they have that red carpet treatment? And but no, I think the for most and Tesla has a different strategy. A lot of their IP is available. They make it available to others to use. So it's not so much about tech transfer. The Neos and Xpeng can use that technology for the most part. It's just a matter of how fast they can scale. Yeah, so I think those are my main thoughts. Hopefully that answered some of the question.
Okay, good. Now we're going to get down and dirty with Ben Baker.
Right, let me share my screen here. Can you see my presentation okay, Beth Allison?
Yep.
All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Ben Baker. I'm the Vice President of Global Sourcing with Blue Dot, where I've been for 16 years. Blue Dot is a furniture design company based in Minneapolis. We partner with factories all around the world to bring our award-winning designs to life. In my role as the Vice President of Global Sourcing, essentially from the point that a design is complete and approved until it is sitting in a box on a shelf in our warehouse, everything that has to happen in between is my responsibility. The beauty of how my role is structured is that each and every one of the challenges of the current global logistics crisis and the resulting impact on Blue Dot is my problem to deal with. Whether that be labor shortages, material costs, or freight delays, I'm the lucky one to have to try and figure them all out. I'm calling this talk today Disruptions and Distractions. I know I'm not the only one who has found myself bouncing from challenge to challenge over the last year, feeling like each new one is a bigger priority than the last. Each new problem distracted me from the previous problem, and as I ended up not giving enough attention to any of them. Before I knew it, the depth of the setbacks grew to a level so unexpected that the first challenges I left unresolved when I was distracted seem like minor issues now. Even now, if I shake the cobwebs out, allow my eyes to look around and focus, I still find it hard to believe the chaos theory of if-then events that had to occur simultaneously to get us where we are today. We can't move freight. There are not enough ships and not enough containers. Our freight gets rolled from sailing to sailing. The big box retailers like Target and Walmart, or big brands like Nike, are even finding their containers being rolled. And for those of you who are not familiar with global logistics, rolling is when you receive a confirmed booking on a container ship, and then you're bumped to the next one, you're rolled. So in order to actually move freight, we have to pay double or triple, sometimes even more. The shipping companies call this their premium service. What it means is that your containers will be rolled because, sorry, we don't have enough space in the ship. Oh, wait, what was that? You said you're willing to pay 3 times your normal rate for that container? Well, Mr. Baker, please place your container here. A space has suddenly opened up. Product and material costs are all rising, whether it be wood, steel, fabric, foam, you name it, the costs have gone up globally. This is not unique to Asia, but it is dramatically more pronounced in Asia than in Europe at the moment. North America is a close second to Asia with rising costs, and frustratingly, they're all tied to either the pandemic and worker shortages or to the rising logistics costs. Factories are over capacity into 2022 in some cases. Starting in July of 2020, when brands and retailers started to see consumer demand rebound back, factories were flooded with orders. We've seen factories where orders are being written a full year out to lock up capacity. And consumer demand is higher than pre-pandemic levels. Demand didn't just bounce back, it kept on going. The Purchasing Managers Index, which is a measure of economic health for manufacturers, is at levels far beyond pre-pandemic demand. All in an environment where just getting the product from the factory to our warehouse is harder than it's been in memory. Let's talk about how we got here, how bad it is, how long it will last, and what we can do about it. So how did we get here? It's a perfect storm. Starting at the time of Chinese New Year last year, to stem the spread of COVID-19, the Chinese government extended the New Year holiday and locked down many parts of the country. Workers who were not in lockdown areas faced travel restrictions that prevented them from returning to the factories. I had staff that were trapped away from our factories for 2 months and more, trying to conduct quality inspections over Zoom, a technology that was brand new to them. Imagine that a year ago, many of us on the call today had probably never used Zoom before. The lockdowns spread to the ports, leading to delays in moving goods out of the country of production, especially out of China. Then came the movement of PPE. Countries around the world suddenly needed PPE in volumes that were unprecedented, and in areas that did not tend to see container traffic regularly. This meant that the shipping companies had containers that were sent to lesser used ports, which then had to be put on trains and moved to areas of countries that do not have exports to put back into the containers. So they left them there, which is a common practice. Moving empty containers is expensive. Around the same time, this would have been April and May of 2020, the bottom seemed to fall out on consumer demand, adding to the lack of desire for the shipping companies to bring the empty containers back from wherever they had landed. So we have both the ships and containers in the wrong place, and consumer demand is at frighteningly low levels. To simplify a complex process, the shipping companies then took containers out of commission, including those they had abandoned, and did not replace them with new ones. They also took ships out of service and brought them in for repairs and upgrades. Then, suddenly, starting in June and July, consumer demand snapped back. Brands and retailers were scrambled to figure out what they needed and started flooding factories with orders. So the consumer demand for goods is strong. The demand to move goods is strong, but we just took a bunch of equipment out of commission, and we've got worker shortages at the docks, the rail yards, and the trucking companies around the world. Workers are out with COVID, are out on quarantine, are out with young children trying to stay on top of remote learning. Demand is high, very high, and supply is low, very low. The exact recipe for rising costs. Materials cost more to produce, more to ship, and workers demand higher wages to work at risk, as they should. This brings us to today. We've created a shortage of equipment in the global logistics networks. We have skyrocketing costs, and we have pent up demand at factories and ports. We're all scrambling to just keep things moving, never mind catching up. For anyone who is interested, there was a well-written article in last weekend's New York Times on this topic, the chaos of the global shipping crisis. I encourage you to have a look at that. But how bad is it really? This graph shows the demand on global logistics compared over the last few years and for the first few months of 2021. This is current as of February. We have the obvious dip in each year around the Lunar New Year holiday, but take a look at 2020, which is in light blue. Starting around week 28, which is in here, demand passed 2019 levels and stayed there for the remainder of the year. In the middle of the pandemic, we needed to move more goods than we did before the pandemic. But it's hard to move those goods when you can't get equipment to move them. Imagine what that light blue line on the previous slide, the demand of 2020, would have looked like if there was enough equipment in circulation. How high would it have gone? In this slide, we can see the current equipment inventory levels at the ports in Asia, again, current as of February, which is not a pretty picture. And it doesn't get any better when we move to India or some of the lesser used ports in Asia and in smaller manufacturing countries. There is simply not enough inventory available to fill with goods and to put on the ships. And we face the rising costs of moving the containers that remain. Shipping costs started their climb around week 22 of 2020 and have kept going up since then. Although they do seem to be leveling off a bit now, we're hopeful they will stay flat and if we're lucky, start to decrease. But how long will this last? Earlier, I referred to the Purchasing Managers Index. The way the index works is that anything below 50 is contraction, and anything above 50 is expansion. By July of 2020, the PMI surpassed July of 2019 and has stayed that high. I'm not an economist, and I'm not going to pretend to be one, but I do think it's reasonable to expect that the recent stimulus plan that passed is going to have some level of additional increased impact on consumer demand. A question that we're waiting to see the outcome on is where the consumer spending will be directed. In 2020, the money we were not spending on services such as hotels, restaurants, flights, and the like was being spent on goods like lovely Blue Dot furniture for our homes. Will it stay that way? How will that impact the big box retailers who consume so much of the logistics space? Will we still do DIY, or will some of our money go to hiring a contractor, leaving less available to spend at Home Depot, for example? One bit of possibly good news is that the amount of inactive ships seems to be decreasing. More are slowly being brought back into service. Unfortunately, I've not been able to get any specific statistics on actual container inventory levels being brought back. Are they building new containers to replace those taken out of commission? I know that we're not seeing it as available inventory at the ports yet. And I am concerned that the price of steel right now is a hindrance to reviving that inventory, bringing containers back into circulation. Well, this is a lot of talk about the problem, but what can we do about it? Luckily, we have some choices. First, you can always wait. Wait for it all to settle out and settle down. The reality is that that will probably not be until sometime in early 2022. So if you have the means to wait, so if you have the means to not wait, don't wait. I said earlier that paying for premium service with the shipping companies is an option. I should be clear, however, that the only delay this really helps you avoid is having your container rolled from sailing to sailing. You are still subject to port congestion, and once you get the container out of the port, you are subject to the delays in the US rail system, which is equally as short-staffed at all points of touch. And I don't know how many times I'm asked if we can just move everything to the US factories so we don't have to deal with this shipping mess. Sure, it's an option. But the US factories have to bring in fabric from overseas mills, or hardware, or frames, components. I recently spoke with one of our domestic upholstery factories, and his whole operation nearly came to a stop because he couldn't get staples delivered to upholster the fabric onto the frames of the sofa. The staples are made in China. Domestic US manufacturing may help, but it does not make you immune to exposure to delays and cost pressures in the global supply chain. We have learned that the average increased delay that while we wait for our rolled containers to finally get an assigned berth on a ship is about 5 weeks. And when we consider that additional 5 weeks and add another 3 weeks of safety buffer, we're adding 8 weeks of transit time to the original averaging of 45 days of transit time. Orders now need to ship 8 weeks earlier than originally committed by our factory partners. If we combine that with the backlog from increased customer demand, we've got a factory capacity challenge. Moving orders forward and dramatically increasing the available capacity within our supplier matrix is a priority. Finally, you can make your freight more attractive to the shippers. At Blue Dot, our warehouse is currently in Minnesota, where we are headquartered. This means that all of the containers we import must be moved from the port to Minnesota, where we unload the containers and then release the empty cans back into the system. Doing this means that the containers are not available to reload or return to Asia for a couple of weeks, best case. This dead zone, where the container is not making money for the shippers, is not attractive to them, especially in the current equipment shortage. The reality is that the premium service offered by the shippers still means the containers are subject to the same downtime. That's part of why they charge so much more. A way around this, which has its own risks and of course cost, is to change the container booking to be port to port, and then work with domestic providers to transload the shipment from container to trailer and truck the goods to Minnesota. Doing this means that the container stays near the port and is available very quickly to the shipping companies to be put back into service. Thus, the freight is more attractive to them. There are obviously additional costs for this, and the cost of trucking right now is inflated. But it still comes out around 30% less than premium service and improves the delivery date by more than 4 weeks on average so far. At Blue Dot, we have leaned heavily into the last two options of my previous slide, factory capacity and attractive freight. We did quickly change our planning lead times, which, as I mentioned earlier, drove the need for increased capacity at our factory partners, which we're still negotiating. It's a pretty big ask. We're looking at our safety stock levels and being surgical about increasing them. While it can soften the blow of many of these unknowns, it is inefficient and costly, not an ideal choice. This is why the focus of our efforts, again, is on increasing capacity with our factory partners and flowing goods sooner, resetting the system to the new normal. As I mentioned earlier, we have been leaning into the strategy of changing our bookings to port. It is working, but it is costing us more money. So we need to be smart about it, ensuring that we're only paying the expedited freight on product that will convert to a sale quickly rather than sit in the warehouse for a few months. I hold cautious optimism and a layer of concern still about the continued availability to get workers for the transload process here in the US and move the product from container to trailer, and to have access to enough truckers to haul the trailers to Minnesota. We're keeping an eye on it and keeping our fingers crossed. At the end of the day, unfortunately, the two things that are most effective at limiting the blow from the ongoing pandemic effect and the logistics delays are the age-old solution of time and money, translation, capacity, and cash. To bring my segment to a close, costs are high. Cost of materials, cost of products, cost of labor, cost of freight, they're all high right now. Capacity is constrained at factories because demand is at highly unexpected levels and is pent up from the ongoing delays. Consumer demand is not lagging, and another stimulus is coming into the economy. Relief isn't in sight yet, but where the stimulus spend lands on goods or on services is to be determined. It's becoming more cliche than it was before the pandemic, but we have to plan for the worst and hope for the best, and plan to spend more this year and likely into next year while we wait for all of the dust to settle from this orchestra of chaos. We have to get face to face, albeit digitally, with our suppliers and lock in capacity, and do your part to make it easier for them to take care of you. Be a better partner. If cash and capacity can support it, spend more to make your freight more attractive to the shippers. You will move goods more quickly. And be nimble. You have to be willing and able to dodge and weave with the unexpected. Thank you.
Very good, Ben.
How do I stop? There we go.
Well done. That was really very well done. Now, do we have any questions from the group? Let's see. We've read that one. Any new questions? Messages. What is Ben's prediction for when the capacity shortage will normalize?
Let me get my crystal ball. What it feels like for most, before the Chinese New Year, all the freight companies were saying, just let us get through Chinese New Year and things will get better. And I never believed that because I saw no indicators that would point to that. Now they're all saying the end of the year. We're going to expect these same impacts into 2022. I think the things that happen, the vaccine rollout is going to help a lot. It's going to bring more workers back into the system. And it's going to allow us to move goods out of port more quickly and to get more truckers hauling goods for us here domestically in the US. I can't take my eye off the price of steel, the cost of iron ore, because in order to bring more containers back in, the shipping companies have to pay for the steel to make those. And I would imagine they're not highly motivated to spend 30 or 60% more on the steel to make those containers. And to see the into Q3 of this year, I think is when we're going to really start to see how the spending settles out. And so if we're lucky, if things continue as they seem to be going, Q3, Q4, we'll start to see an end in sight, I believe.
Okay. We're getting absolutely inundated with accolades from the viewers.
I see a message here. What is the extra cost of having your load transshipped at port from container to truck? The cost amount of the transloading itself is varies in price, but whether you have your load floor loaded or palletized from the factory. If it's palletized, it's only a few $100s. If it's floor loaded, it's 8 to 12 is what we're seeing. But the all-in cost of getting a truck out of the port and bringing it to right now is coming out to between $5,000 and $6,000 from the port of LA. Now, that gets a little bit spread across the cost per container because a trailer can hold 1.5 containers worth of product. So you're paying for 2 trucks on every 3 containers. What we've averaged so far, and we've been able to do this now with about 70 containers, which moved very, very quickly. We saw bookings that were being rolled for weeks suddenly get a berth on a ship within 3 days, starting from when we rebook these as port to port. But we're averaging about $4,000 in additional costs for each shipment right now. Another question: who owns, controls the container shipping companies? Who owns the container shipping companies? So we do our Asia booking is done with a company called Flexport. Most of our Asia booking is with a forwarder called Flexport, and they are the ones who own the contracts with the actual shipping companies. I mean, a lot of the shipping companies are European owned for the most part, but exactly which ones we're on with each ship, I don't have that in my head. Let's see. Have you added the cost to your prices to this customer? No, we have not. We have not increased our prices from this right now. We're finding ways to balance it.
And I've got a question here from Don Johnson. You mentioned your QC process is now by Zoom. Is that working? And when will you travel again?
Mm-hmm. This is the longest I've been grounded in one spot since I was 10 years old. This isn't easy for me personally. I'm used to being on the road almost full time. The QC process by Zoom has its drawbacks. We've partnered with a company, a Danish software company called Karma, Q-A-R-M-A. I can't say enough good things about them for a company our size, as a QC platform for us. And it allows us to manage the QC process from remotely. So we can have the same level of QC service from our factories, whether we're there or not. The value I have in Asia is that my QC team there is able to manage that process. It's working okay. We haven't seen an increase in quality, in quality claims. It does slow things down, especially on the new development side. It takes a little bit longer because we still want to get somebody's hands on the new products, and so it slows things down, but it does work. I don't anticipate I'll travel again until I think Q3 at the earliest. The big determinant for me is not when I can get vaccinated, but when the Chinese government will allow me back into the country without a 2-week quarantine in a hotel of their choice. which is not an attractive option for me. Let's see, there's another follow-up question. Would more US container shipping companies be a partial solution? I don't know. I don't know if it would. I think anybody who can get more shipping containers into the global networks is what it takes. The biggest slowdown is getting the physical containers in there. Right now, there's a lot of slowdown at the ports. That will be worked through and resolved when the workers are starting to come back. And that's one that you kind of you can put a plan around the port congestions. But if you don't have containers, you don't have containers. And so it's not just the ships to move them, but you got to have the physical metal box to put stuff into. And that's our biggest delay.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions. Are you, Ben?
Nope, we're good.
All right. I think that'll probably wrap it up. Great job, speakers. Great job, everybody. And
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.